Hi, everybody. Tonight, we will begin a long journey into a quiet but strangely shimmering corner of history, where whispers carried more weight than royal decrees, and where desire, hidden or unabashed, could alter the course of kingdoms. This is a story of queens whose lives were draped in both velvet and rumor, whose reigns were marked not only by politics and war, but by scandal, passion, and choices that defied the expectations of their time. We will not rush, for this is a tale best told like an old candle burning low, slowly, with a warm but steady light. Our story begins far back in the heart of the Middle Ages, when Europe was a patchwork of rival courts, stone keeps, and echoing chapels. In these places, queens were more than wives. They were symbols of alliances, bearers of heirs, and sometimes the quiet force behind a king's most decisive acts. But now and then, a queen stepped beyond the expected boundaries and left her life shaped as much by private desires as by public duty. Some were loved for it, others feared, and still others condemned by the ink of chroniclers who could not or would not tell where truth ended and scandal began. We shall first travel to the kingdom of Navarre in the early 14th century, where Queen II ruled, a woman caught between duty and whispered sin. In her youth, the court of France buzzed with a scandal later known as the Tour de Nesle affair, a web of accusations that two princesses, her sisters-in-law, had been unfaithful to their royal husbands. The chroniclers wrote that Joan's own name appeared in murmured accusations, though the evidence was no stronger than a shadow at dusk. Yet she was spared the prison walls that swallowed the others, and in time she ascended her own throne. Whether the rumors were truth or venom, none could say, but they lingered in the air of her court like the faint scent of smoke long after the fire is gone. From Navarre, we drift across the narrow sea to England in the reign of Edward II. Here lived Queen Isabella, called the she-wolf of France. She arrived in England as a young bride, poised and beautiful, yet quickly learned her husband's heart leaned toward his favorites, men who wielded influence far beyond the king's affection. Isabella's patience was long, but not endless. Over years, she transformed from neglected queen to political player, and in the course of her rebellion against her husband, a new figure appeared, Roger Mortimer. Their bond, whether born of passion, ambition, or both, scandalized the realm. Chroniclers, perhaps eager to inflame, painted her as a queen undone by lust, who took a lover openly while her husband languished in captivity. Whether their union was truly carnal or more a partnership of power is uncertain, yet the image endured, etched deep into English memory. Now we step quietly into the courts of Castile, where Queen Joanna of Castile, known as Joanna the Mad, lived a life consumed by an overwhelming love that, to her contemporaries, seemed indecent in its intensity. Married to Philip the Handsome, she adored him with a fervor rare for royal unions of her time. Yet when he strayed, she burned with jealousy so fierce it blurred the line between devotion and obsession. Chroniclers wrote of her confronting his mistresses, even of striking women she suspected. When Philip died suddenly, her grief transformed into a near mythic tale, that she would not allow his body to be buried, carrying the coffin with her for months on her travels, guarding it as if death itself could not part them. Whether truth or legend, her story became a mirror through which her people saw both love's beauty and its madness. From Spain, our path turns north again to the chilly courts of Denmark, where Queen Caroline Matilda lived centuries later, but in a world still bound by the heavy expectations of royal women. Married to King Christian II, whose erratic mind left him distant and unpredictable, she found companionship in Johann Struensee, the king's physician. Their closeness deepened into intimacy, and soon the court hummed with rumors that the queen and the doctor were lovers. Together, they began to shape policy, reforming the kingdom in ways that angered the nobility. But passion and politics made a dangerous pairing. When the tide turned against them, the scandal was wielded like a sword. Struensee was executed, and Caroline Matilda was exiled, her youth cut short by illness in a foreign land. The whispers, however, outlived them both. And so, in each of these lives, there is a pattern, half woven from truth, half from the eager hands of gossip. Medieval chroniclers, mostly men of the church, saw in such queens either cautionary tales or opportunities to moralize. In their ink, desire was painted as vice, female independence as rebellion, and the bending of marital vows as proof of corruption. But perhaps, when the candlelight fades and we listen closely, these stories are not so simple. For beneath the veils of rumor lies something enduring, the quiet truth that queens were human. They loved, they erred, they longed for freedom, they acted in ways that defied the cages built for them. And in a time when a single misstep could mean ruin, the fact that any such stories survived to reach us suggests that what they did, or were believed to have done, was powerful enough to echo through centuries. As our journey continues, we will pause in each of these courts, walking the marble halls and the cold gardens, hearing the murmur of courtiers and the rustle of silks. We will see not only the scandal, but the world that surrounded it, the politics, the alliances, the pressures of dynastic duty. And perhaps, in the slow telling, we will find that what made these queens infamous was not simply desire, but the courage to live in ways that could not be neatly contained by the laws of men. Tonight, though, we remain at the edge of the story, our candle just lit, the night stretching ahead. The queens are waiting, each in her own time and place, and we will meet them one by one, not in the hurried judgments of history, but in the lingering, unhurried light, where truth and legend lie side by side, and where every whisper has a shadow. In the first years of her reign, Queen Joan II of Navarre learned that power in a medieval court was not a fixed crown upon one's head, but a restless thing, slipping, shifting, swayed by whispers and loyalties as changeable as the wind. Her court at Pamplona sat between the great powers of France and Castile, its halls alive with the rustle of silk skirts, the murmuring of clerics, and the clinking of goblets during winter feasts. Joan had inherited a kingdom still bearing the faint scars of her father's rule, a realm that had long been treated as a pawn in the wider chessboard of French politics. She was determined to steady it, to carve out an identity for Navarre that was neither overshadowed by the French crown nor swallowed by Castilian ambition. Yet the shadows of her youth lingered. Courtiers who had been present in Paris during the Tour de Nesle affair watched her closely. They never spoke the accusations aloud, but their eyes on certain days seemed to hold questions they dared not voice. Her husband, Philip of Evreux, was a quiet man by the standards of medieval nobility, more inclined toward counsel and treaties than tournaments or pageantry. Together, they ruled as partners, though Navarre's customs placed the sovereign authority in Joan's hands. This was unusual for the time, and in the candlelit councils of neighboring kingdoms, it was remarked upon, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with suspicion. Life in Pamplona followed the slow rhythm of medieval governance, petitions from nobles seeking favor, disputes over land boundaries, negotiations over trade routes through the Pyrenees. But there were also moments of softness, summer hunts in the green foothills, evenings where musicians from Provence filled the halls with the sound of the lute, and processions during feast days when the people cheered as the queen passed through the narrow streets, her gown trailing like a river of gold. Yet Joan knew that the life of a queen was never untouched by intrigue. A certain lady-in-waiting, Isabelle d'Armagnac, had begun to gather influence at court. Isabelle's laughter rang out too freely, her wit biting enough to draw smiles even from the most solemn knights. She had the ear of several young nobles, and there were rumors, quiet but persistent, that she carried messages between rival factions in the kingdom. Joan, who had once survived the venom of courtly scandal, recognized the faint scent of it now. She watched Isabelle carefully, saying nothing, as was her way, for to act too swiftly was to confirm suspicion in the minds of those already inclined to believe it. Beyond Navarre's borders, the century was shaping itself into one of turbulence. In France, the Capetian line teetered on the brink of extinction, with disputes over succession that would one day ignite the 100 Years' War. In Castile, the court was restless, the young king surrounded by advisors with eyes set on expansion. Joan understood that a queen's personal reputation could be weaponized in such times. Scandal, even old scandal, was a currency. And so, though she maintained dignity in public, she moved her pieces quietly, forging alliances with towns, securing the loyalty of minor nobles, and sending carefully worded letters to the papal court in Avignon. In the quiet hours of night, when the torches in the palace corridors burned low and the sound of the city had faded, Joan sometimes allowed her mind to wander back to Paris, the long galleries of the Louvre, the cool shadow of Notre Dame, the summer evenings when the Seine carried the smell of blooming lindens. She thought of the trial of her sisters-in-law, of the harsh sentences, and of the strange fact that she alone had emerged unscathed. Was it luck? Was it the shield of powerful friends? Or was it, as some chroniclers later implied, that her part in the affair had been real, but carefully hidden? Joan never spoke of it, and so history was left with a silence into which imagination eagerly poured. Her own marriage was free of public scandal, but it was not without its quiet complexities. Philip of Evreux was courteous, faithful in the way that medieval chronicles so rarely mention because it was so uncommon, yet there was a certain distance between them, an understanding that love was not the foundation of their bond. It was partnership, mutual interest, and perhaps, on the gentler days, a kind of friendship. They shared a table, a throne, and the burdens of governance, but in the private chambers of the palace, they often retreated to their own company. One winter, when snow lay thick on the roofs of Pamplona and the cold crept even into the great halls, Joan hosted a feast to mark the Feast of Epiphany. The tables groaned beneath roasted boar, spiced wine, and almond confections. Minstrels from Toulouse played soft ballads, their words drifting like smoke through the air. During this feast, Joan noticed Isabel once again, seated near a visiting knight from Gascony, her head bent close to his. Their smiles were quick, their conversation hidden beneath the music. Something in the scene struck Joan as familiar, the same quiet signals, the same deliberate carelessness that had once surrounded the princesses of France before their downfall. That night, she called for her most trusted advisor, an elderly bishop named Martin de la Raya, who had known her since she was a girl. She spoke little, only enough to have him understand that the court must be watched more closely in the weeks to come. The bishop, whose hands trembled with age, crossed himself and promised to keep his ears open. It was the nature of queenship in the Middle Ages to balance the visible and the unseen, to sit in open audience before the people while, in the shadows, guarding against the smallest seeds of disorder. Joan moved through these roles with care, aware that one false step could awaken the old whispers. Her life, like the winter sky over Navarre, was often clear, but edged with a thin rim of storm, and yet there were days of peace. In early spring, she would ride out into the valleys, the wind pulling at her veil, the hills blooming with wildflowers. She would stop in small villages, speaking with women who baked bread in outdoor ovens, listening to their worries about harvest and drought. These moments grounded her, pulling her away from the echoing corridors of the palace. Here, there were no rumors, no courtiers to weigh each word, only the quiet exchange between ruler and people. It was in such moments that Joan seemed to remember herself most, not as the survivor of scandal, not as the political figure balanced between kingdoms, but simply as a woman, with her own thoughts and unspoken longings. And it was perhaps in these same moments that she sensed the fragility of her place in history, knowing that her life would be written not as she lived it, but as others chose to remember it. The spring following that cold winter brought with it an air of change. In Pamplona, the thaw released the river from its icy hold, and its waters rushed fast and full, carrying with them the sound of renewal. The markets swelled with merchants from Aragon, Gascony, and the Basque coast, their stalls bright with bolts of dyed cloth, barrels of salted fish, and the rare spices brought up from the south. The city seemed alive, yet in the palace, the mood was more restrained. Joan had been receiving reports from Bishop Martin de la Raya. His voice, already slow from age, had grown softer still, as though each word needed careful weighing. The bishop spoke of quiet gatherings in the quarters of certain young nobles, of conversations that ended abruptly when a servant entered, and of letters arriving under strange seals. These were the kinds of details that might mean nothing, or everything, depending on the winds of politics. Among the names that surfaced again was that of Isabel de Armagnac. She was no fool. She knew she was being watched. Her behavior became a study in balance, never absent from court functions, yet never at the center, her smile polite but measured, her conversations short and seemingly without weight. Yet Joan recognized the performance. The skill with which Isabel navigated the gaze of the court was itself a sign that something moved beneath the surface. The queen had learned long ago that in moments of uncertainty, patience could be sharper than a sword. She summoned her husband, Philip of Evreux, to a private council in her solar, a room warmed by a deep-set hearth and scented faintly with lavender. There she spoke not of suspicion directly, but of the need to reaffirm loyalty among the nobles, perhaps through a series of small grants of land or exemptions from certain taxes. Philip, pragmatic as ever, agreed without question, not probing too deeply into what had stirred this decision. It was one of the things Joan valued most about him, his willingness to trust her judgment without pressing for reasons. That year, the Feast of St. Firmin approached with unusual anticipation. Pilgrims began arriving from distant regions, filling the city with a steady hum of devotion. For Joan, it was an opportunity to display unity, to remind both the people and the visiting dignitaries that Navarre's crown sat firmly upon her head. She ordered new banners to be hung along the processional route, their colors deep and rich, the emblem of Navarre embroidered in fine gold thread. On the morning of the feast, the city seemed transformed. Bells rang from the cathedral, and the streets were thick with the scent of fresh bread and roasted meats. Joan rode in a procession, her gown a deep crimson that caught the sunlight, her crown modest but unmistakable. The people bowed as she passed, some calling blessings, others simply watching in silence. Isabel was among the ladies who followed on horseback, her eyes lowered, her expression serene. It was after the procession, in the cool shade of the palace gardens, that Joan noticed something that tightened her thoughts like a closed fist. A young knight, one of the Gascon visitors, stood speaking to Isabel, their heads bent close, their voices nearly lost beneath the splash of the fountain. When they parted, Joan saw a glint of parchment pass from Isabel's sleeve to his hand, so quickly that another might have missed it entirely. That night, when the palace grew quiet and only the guards moved through the torch-lit corridors, Joan sat at her writing table. The wax of the candles pooled at their bases, and the air was still. She began a letter, not to Philip nor to the bishop, but to a trusted ally in the court of Aragon. The language was careful, almost artless in its politeness, but between the lines it carried a message. There were currents in Navarre that needed watching, and those currents might not stop at the Pyrenees. Beyond these matters of intrigue, life in the palace carried on with the gentle routines that made up most of a queen's days. In the mornings, Joan heard petitions from the guilds, merchants concerned with tariffs and the rights to certain market spaces. In the afternoons, she attended to correspondence, answering letters from abbots, mayors, and neighboring lords. In the evenings, she sometimes played chess with Philip, the pieces carved from ivory, the game slow and deliberate. But no matter how ordinary the hours appeared, Joan's mind was rarely still. She had lived too long under the weight of others' expectations to believe that stability was natural. Stability was earned, guarded, and maintained with a watchful eye. And in the quiet moments, when her ladies were at their embroidery, when the fire was low, when even the guards seemed half asleep, she would think back to the lessons Paris had taught her. There, in that city of light and shadow, she had learned that scandal was never truly buried. It lingered like a faint echo, ready to be called back at the slightest provocation. As summer deepened, news began to arrive from France. The Valois had taken the throne after the death of Charles IV, ending the direct Capetian line. This shift in power was of more than passing interest to Joan. Her own claim to the French crown had been a subject of dispute, though ultimately denied in favor of Salic law. The change meant new alliances to consider, and possibly new threats. The French court would be watching Navarre closely, and any sign of unrest within its walls could be used as a lever. One evening, as the sun set in a wash of gold over the rooftops, Jeanne stood at the highest balcony of the palace. The city stretched out before her, the river glinting like a strip of polished steel. Somewhere below, children's laughter floated up through the warm air, mingling with the scent of baking bread. It was a peaceful scene, and yet she could not shake the awareness that peace, in her position, was rarely more than a pause between storms. Her gaze turned toward the south, where the mountains rose dark against the horizon. Somewhere beyond them lay the court of Aragon, and beyond that, Castile, and in the middle of it all, Navarre, her kingdom, her burden, and her shield. Whatever moved beneath the surface of her court, she would meet it as she had met everything else in her life, quietly, deliberately, and without the luxury of forgetting. The heat of summer settled heavily over Pamplona, pressing down on the city until even the stone walls of the palace seemed to hold the warmth long after sunset. The air in the great hall was thick with the smell of wax and perfumed oils, and the servants moved more slowly, their faces flushed from the kitchen fires. Joan rose earlier than usual in these months, preferring the pale coolness of dawn to the stifling afternoons. She would walk in the palace gardens when the dew still clung to the grass, accompanied by only one or two ladies, and listen to the low hum of bees in the lavender hedges. It was during one of these walks that Bishop Martin approached her with a matter too important to delay. He had, he said, obtained a piece of information about the Gascon knight who had been seen speaking to Isabel during the feast of Saint Firmin. The knight had since left Pamplona, traveling eastward toward the border with Aragon, but not before sending several sealed packets by mounted courier. The recipients were unknown, but the bishop's informants believed one was destined for a noble house with known sympathies toward the Castilian court. Joan listened without interruption, her hands folded lightly before her. She asked no questions, not yet. When the bishop finished, she dismissed her companions and continued walking, her pace steady, her expression unreadable. If Isabel's dealings crossed into the realm of foreign correspondence, then the matter was no longer a question of courtly mischief. It was treachery, subtle perhaps, but dangerous in the wrong hands. Later that day, she summoned Isabel privately to her solar. The room was warm, the shutters drawn just enough to keep out the brightest glare. On the table lay a small silver bowl filled with apricots, their skins flushed gold and red. Joan invited her lady to sit and offered her fruit, speaking in the same calm tone she used for idle conversation. They spoke first of small matters, the comfort of the guests, the arrangements for the next feast day, the state of the Queen's new embroidery. Only when the conversation had taken on the rhythm of ease did Joan mention the Gascon knight. She spoke his name as though it were a passing recollection, watching Isabel's face closely. A flicker, so slight it might have been imagined, passed across her expression. Then came the smile, the polite denial, the insistence that their conversation had been nothing more than pleasantry. Joan neither accused nor pressed her. Instead, she spoke of loyalty, how in a kingdom as small as Navarre, trust among its people was the true mortar that held its walls. Her words carried no open threat, yet in the quiet of the room, they seemed to linger like the echo of something unspoken. When Isabel left, her steps were light, but her eyes had grown more cautious. That evening, Joan withdrew to her private chamber. The day's heat had given way to a warm dusk, and from her window she could see the lanterns beginning to glow along the palace courtyard. Philip joined her for a quiet meal, the two of them speaking of the latest message from Aragon. There was to be a marriage alliance between a lesser branch of the Aragonese royal family and a noble house loyal to the French crown. Such news seemed harmless enough on the surface, but Joan read it differently. The web of allegiances was shifting, and Navarre's position in that web needed constant attention. In the weeks that followed, she began to make small changes at court. Certain tasks that had once been Isabel's responsibility were quietly reassigned. New attendants, drawn from loyal families in the countryside, were brought into her household. These were adjustments that might go unnoticed by those not looking closely, but Joan was building a barrier, one piece at a time, against any influence she did not control. One late afternoon, as thunderclouds gathered over the mountains, Joan sat in the audience chamber hearing petitions from her subjects. A group of merchants from Tudela came forward, complaining of increased bandit activity along the southern trade roads. As they spoke, Joan's thoughts were already moving beyond the petition itself. Banditry often flared in times of political instability, and she wondered if these disturbances might be connected, loosely perhaps, but connected nonetheless, to the undercurrents she had begun to sense. That night, rain lashed against the palace windows, and the sound filled the corridors with a steady roar. Joan lay awake long after the candles had been extinguished, her mind turning over the small signs she had gathered. The passing of a sealed packet, the evasive smile of a lady in waiting, the shifting ties between neighboring courts. She knew better than to act too soon. In politics, timing was a weapon as sharp as any blade. But she also knew that the moment for patience would not last forever. In the days that followed, she took refuge in the routines that gave her mind space to work. She oversaw the inspection of the royal stables, where the smell of hay and warm horseflesh replaced the heavy scents of the palace. She visited the cathedral, kneeling before the altar in silent prayer while the stained glass threw jeweled light across the flagstones. She presided over a small council to discuss the harvest yields, the grain stores, and the plans for winter provisioning. But beneath it all, her watchfulness did not waver. Joan understood that power was not only in the crown or the throne, it was in the ability to see what others did not, to sense a change in the air before the wind shifted. And as the summer deepened toward autumn, she could feel it still, like the faint tremor before a storm, waiting for the moment to break. Autumn came to Navarre in a slow unfurling of color, the hillsides turning to russet and gold, the air crisp with the scent of wood smoke. In Pamplona, the markets filled with late apples, walnuts, and the deep purple of harvested grapes. The palace kitchens hummed with preparation for the season's feasts, and in the city streets, the talk was of the approaching All Saints celebrations. For Joan, this was a season she both loved and measured with care. The cooler air brought relief from summer's stifling heat, yet it also brought the nobles back from their estates, their returns swelling the court with new gossip, old grudges, and the constant shuffle of ambition. The corridors grew more crowded, the audience chamber busier. It was during this season that intrigues often rekindled, for proximity was their lifeblood. Isabelle de Armagnac had grown quieter in recent weeks. She still attended the Queen, still moved with the same grace, but the easy laughter that had once been her signature was rarer now, replaced by a careful composure. Joan watched her as one might watch a candle in a draft, uncertain if it would flicker or burn steadily. She knew that she was under scrutiny, and for the moment, that awareness kept her in check. But the court's attention soon shifted to another matter. A delegation from Aragon arrived, led by Don Ramon de Villafranca, a man whose reputation for charm was matched only by his skill in negotiation. His purpose was ostensibly to discuss trade routes over the Pyrenees, but Joan suspected there was more to his mission. Foreign envoys rarely came without layers of intent. The first formal meeting took place in the Great Hall, the air thick with the mingled scents of beeswax and damp wool from the travelers' cloaks. Don Ramon spoke warmly of friendship between Navarre and Aragon, of the benefits of mutual cooperation. Yet Joan noted the way his eyes lingered on the assembled courtiers, as if weighing their importance, their allegiances. That evening, she held a smaller gathering in her private chambers, inviting only a select few nobles and members of the Aragonese party. The fire burned brightly against the early chill, and cups of warm spiced wine loosened conversation. Here, the tone shifted from formal to personal, with tales of hunts and border festivals. It was in this more relaxed setting that Don Ramon mentioned, almost in passing, his acquaintance with a certain Gascon knight who had lately been in Pamplona. Joan felt the remark settle like a pebble dropped into still water, sending ripples through her thoughts. She asked nothing further in that moment, only smiled as though the comment had been of casual interest. But when the gathering ended, she spoke quietly to Bishop Martin, instructing him to see if the knight's name appeared in any recent correspondence or trade manifests. The following days brought a rhythm of diplomacy. Joan met with the Aragonese envoys, walked with them through the palace gardens, and allowed them to attend the cathedral service on Sunday beside her. Every word exchanged was measured, every glance weighed. The business of trade was discussed at length, but Joan could not shake the sense that something more subtle was being tested, whether Navarre's loyalties might be coaxed toward Aragon or perhaps divided from France. Meanwhile, reports came from the southern roads that bandit attacks had ceased as suddenly as they had begun. To most, this was welcome news, but to Joan it was troubling. Disorder that disappears without cause often means its purpose has been fulfilled. She wondered if those attacks had been meant as a signal, a way to pressure the court's attention in one direction while something else moved in another. One afternoon, while the sun slanted low across the courtyards, Joan received an unexpected visitor, a merchant from Toulouse, traveling under a safe conduct. He carried bolts of fine cloth as a gift for the queen, but more importantly, he carried news. In quiet tones, he spoke of letters being passed in Aragon that hinted at a friend within the Navarrese court who could be relied upon to influence decisions in favor of their interests. The merchant, uncertain of the truth, had brought the matter to Joan out of respect for his trading privileges. When he was gone, Joan sat in her chair for a long while, her hands resting still in her lap. If the claim was genuine, the friend in question could be any number of courtiers, yet the list in her mind narrowed quickly to one. She began to plan. Not rashly, not in the heat of suspicion, but with the slow precision of one who knew the cost of a false move. The All Saints' feast would bring the court together under one roof, a gathering where masks of civility were worn as easily as the jeweled ones brought out for masquerades. In such a setting, she might see more than in a dozen private interviews. As the days shortened and the mornings grew colder, Joan felt the air around her court tighten. It was not yet a storm, but there was a weight to it, as though the season itself had drawn a breath it would not release until the truth, whatever it was, had come to light. The days before All Saints were filled with a restless energy. Servants hurried through the palace carrying bolts of fabric, trays of gilded plate, and baskets of late autumn flowers. The cathedral's bells tolled more often, their deep notes carrying across the rooftops, reminding the city of the solemnity to come. In the great hall, tapestries were taken down for cleaning and replaced with those depicting the lives of saints, their embroidered halos catching the flicker of torchlight. Joan oversaw these preparations with her usual calm, moving from one chamber to another with a measured step. She spoke little, allowing her attendants to work, but nothing escaped her notice. Which nobles lingered together in corners, whose laughter came too easily, which faces turned serious when certain names were spoken. It was the kind of quiet watchfulness that most mistook for detachment, yet it was in these moments that Joan gathered the pieces of her understanding. Isabelle d'Armagnac had taken great care in the weeks leading up to the feast. Her gowns were chosen with modest restraint, her attendance at gatherings dutiful but unremarkable. To the casual eye, she was merely a loyal lady in waiting. But Joan had lived too long at court to trust in appearances alone. A mask worn with such precision often concealed more than a careless smile ever could. The feast began on the eve of the holy day, with vespers in the cathedral. The light of hundreds of candles shimmered against the stone, filling the space with a golden glow. Joan stood before the altar in her deep blue mantle, the crown of Navarre resting lightly on her head. Philip was beside her, his expression composed, his hands folded in prayer. Around them, the court stood in careful rows, the rustle of silk and the scent of beeswax mingling in the cool air. After the service, the procession returned to the palace for the first of the banquets. The great hall was lit with candelabras, the long tables laid with trenchers of roasted game, sugared fruits, and spiced wine. Minstrels played softly from the gallery above, their melodies winding through the hum of conversation. Joan moved among her guests, speaking a few words here, offering a nod there, her smile never fading, yet her attention never fixed on any one exchange. It was during the second course, as the dishes of pike and almond sauce were being served, that Joan's watchfulness found its mark. Across the hall, she saw Isabelle rise from her place, moving toward one of the side doors under the pretense of speaking to a servant. Moments later, Don Ramon de Villafranca excused himself from his seat among the Aragonese delegation and followed in the same direction. Joan did not move at once. She continued speaking with the abbot of Lair, her voice smooth, her face serene. Only when she was certain no eyes were on her did she rise, excusing herself quietly. She took a side passage she knew well, one that led behind the smaller audience chamber, where the door Isabelle and Don Ramon had chosen would open. From the shadow of the narrow corridor, Joan could hear voices, low, quick, and urgent. She could not make out every word, but she caught enough to know they spoke not of courtly pleasantries, but of something arranged, something to be carried beyond the walls of Navarre. The faint sound of parchment rustling reached her, followed by the soft snap of a seal being pressed. When the conversation ended, footsteps moved away in opposite directions. Joan waited until the silence was certain before stepping into the empty chamber. On the table stood a silver ewer and 2 cups, untouched. No paper remained, but the faint smell of warm wax lingered in the air. She returned to the feast without any sign of disturbance, taking her place once more beside Philip. Her expression was unchanged, her voice steady as she joined in the toasts to the saints. Yet in her mind, the pieces of the pattern she had been assembling fell into a clearer shape. She had seen enough to know her suspicions were well placed, but not enough to move openly without risking the balance she had worked to maintain. The next morning, the feast continued with a public display of almsgiving. Joan and Philip stood before the palace gates, handing coins, bread, and woolen cloaks to the poor of the city. The crowd's gratitude was loud and genuine, their voices rising in blessing. But Joan's thoughts were elsewhere, fixed on the sealed packet she had not seen, the words she had only half heard. That evening, after the final prayers were said and the torches lit in the palace courtyard, she called Bishop Martin to her chambers. She spoke to him without embellishment, recounting what she had witnessed. The bishop listened in silence, his lined face grave. When she finished, he asked only whether she wished to confront the matter at once. Joan shook her head. Timing, she said, was not yet ripe. For now, the mask of harmony would remain. The court would see its queen attending to the duties of the season, offering generosity, hearing petitions, presiding over feasts. But beneath that calm surface, Joan's mind worked without rest, preparing for the moment when the truth could be laid bare without doubt and without escape. The first frosts came early that year. One morning in mid-November, Joan looked out from her chamber window to see the gardens whitened as though dusted with powdered sugar, the last of the roses hanging stiff and brittle on their stems. The air inside the palace had taken on that dry chill that made every sound carry farther. The clink of a cup on a table, the shuffle of a servant's feet, the low murmur of 2 courtiers speaking behind a half-closed door. It was in such quietness that Joan preferred to think. The season of large gatherings was drawing to its close, and soon the nobles would begin to return to their own estates for winter. But not yet. There were still a few weeks in which the palace remained crowded, and in those weeks she intended to act with subtlety. Isabelle d'Armagnac, perhaps sensing that her moment of freedom had narrowed, moved more cautiously than ever. She spoke little and kept close to her duties, attending to Joan at Mass, in the audience chamber, and during the small, private suppers the queen shared with her inner circle. But there was a certain alertness in her eyes, as though she knew the queen had seen something but could not be sure how much. Joan decided on a different approach, one that would not provoke alarm. She began to summon various courtiers to her for private conversations, under the guise of planning the Christmas celebrations. She spoke to them about the arrangements for music, the placement of tables, the order of seating, but she also slipped in questions, carefully worded, lightly spoken, about who had been speaking to who had received letters, who had been unusually absent from certain gatherings. Through these quiet talks, she began to gather threads. A name surfaced more than once: Lord Martin de Ibar, a minor noble with modest lands near the southern border. He had been seen in conversation with both Isabel and Don Ramon de Villafranca, sometimes in public, sometimes in more private corners of the palace. On its own, such contact might mean little. Diplomatic guests often sought the company of local nobles. But in Joan's mind, the pieces began to align. One evening, as snowflakes drifted lazily against the blackness beyond the windows, Joan invited Lord Martin to dine with her and Philip in a small chamber near the chapel. The meal was simple: roasted quail, lentils, and warm bread, but the setting was intimate, with only a single servant to pour the wine. Conversation turned to the condition of the southern roads, the state of the harvest in his lands, the loyalty of his vassals. He answered easily, but Joan watched the way he hesitated when she mentioned Aragon, how he sipped his wine a moment longer before replying that relations were, to his knowledge, cordial. After he had gone, Philip remarked that Lord Martin seemed nervous, though he could not say why. Joan only nodded. She had seen the same thing, and for her, it was not nervousness without cause. The next morning, Bishop Martin brought word that a messenger from Aragon had been spotted at an inn just beyond the city walls, keeping to himself and leaving before dawn. The innkeeper, loyal to the crown, had noted that the man carried a small leather case strapped to his saddle and that he had spoken with someone matching Lord Martin's description 2 nights before. Joan's course was becoming clearer, but she still held her hand. A premature accusation could fracture the delicate balance of loyalties in the court, especially with winter closing in. For now, she would watch, and she would wait for the next move to be made, not by her, but by those who thought themselves hidden. In the days that followed, she took part in the Advent observances, appearing in the cathedral each Sunday, her presence a quiet assurance to the people of Pamplona that their queen stood firm. She ordered extra provisions to be distributed to the poor, and she personally inspected the stores of grain in the palace cellars, ensuring that none had been siphoned off for private profit. All of this she did with the steady hand of a ruler at peace, though in truth her mind was sharp and searching. One night, during compline, she noticed Isabel's absence. It was unusual, for Isabel was rarely away from her side during such ceremonies. Afterward, Joan asked her ladies if Isabel had been unwell, but none could say. They had last seen her in the early evening, speaking with one of the Aragonese envoys near the library. By the time Joan returned to her chambers, she had already sent a discreet order to have the doors to the city watched through the night. If Isabel was meeting someone beyond the palace walls, it would be known by morning. The order was simple, its delivery quiet, but it carried with it the weight of a queen who had learned that knowledge, once in her hands, was as potent as any decree. Before dawn, the city lay under a thin layer of frost, the streets silent, but for the occasional creak of a shutter in the wind. Joan rose earlier than usual, the air in her chamber cold enough to make her breath visible in the candlelight. She sat at her small writing table, quill in hand, not yet writing but thinking, her gaze fixed on the wavering flame. When the knock came at her door, it was quiet, deliberate. Bishop Martin entered, his cloak dusted with white from the night's frost. He bowed, then spoke without preamble. Isabel had been seen slipping through the narrow postern gate in the palace's eastern wall, accompanied by a cloaked figure believed to be one of the Aragonese attendants. They had met in the shadow of the old olive grove beyond the walls, and remained there for a short while before parting, Isabel returning alone, the attendant heading toward the southern road. Joan listened in silence, her hands folded on the table. The postern gate was seldom used, its key kept by only a few trusted guards. That Isabel had gained access to it meant she either held influence over one of them or had been given the key by someone higher in the chain of command. Both possibilities spoke of deeper roots to this intrigue than she had so far uncovered. By mid-morning, the palace was stirring with the usual rhythm of winter. Fires were lit in the great hearths, servants carried baskets of split logs, and the kitchens filled with the scent of baking bread. Joan moved through these familiar scenes with her usual composure, greeting petitioners, speaking with her steward about the arrival of a shipment of wool from the north. Yet her mind circled back, again and again, to the image of Isabel in the frost-dark grove. That evening, she summoned Lord Martin d'Abar once more, this time under the guise of requesting his advice on a matter concerning the southern tolls. He arrived promptly, dressed in a fur-lined mantle against the cold. Joan received him in the smaller council room, the firelight casting long shadows across the polished table. She questioned him lightly about the state of trade, the merchants' complaints, and the condition of the roads. He answered smoothly at first, but when she shifted the conversation to the security of the postern gate, his replies became less fluid. He claimed ignorance of any unusual use of the gate, but Joan noted the way his eyes flicked briefly toward the fire rather than meeting hers. She let the moment pass without challenge, allowing him to leave with his dignity intact. But when he was gone, she called for the captain of the palace guard. Her orders were precise. The key to the postern gate was to be brought directly to her. No one, under any circumstance, was to pass through without her knowledge. 2 guards, chosen for their loyalty, would be posted there through the night, and any message, no matter how small, leaving the palace was to be intercepted and brought first to her chamber. For several days, the court seemed to settle into a calm that might have fooled an outsider. The Advent season deepened, and preparations for Christmas began in earnest. Laurel and holly were brought in from the countryside to decorate the chapel. The choir rehearsed hymns in the cold air until their voices carried like silver through the cloisters. But beneath this outward peace, Joan's measures were quietly at work. On the 4th day after her orders, one of the guards brought her a folded scrap of parchment, intercepted from a servant carrying it toward the city gates. The writing was small, hurried, and unsigned. It spoke of arrangements confirmed and delivery to be made before the feast of St. Stephen. No names were mentioned, no place named, yet the tone was urgent enough to set Joan's thoughts in motion. That night, she did not sleep. She sat in her chamber, wrapped in a fur-lined mantle, the intercepted message before her, and listened to the sound of the wind against the shutters. She knew the feast of St. Stephen was less than a fortnight away. Whatever was being planned would be set in motion soon. And if she was to stop it, she would need to draw the players into the open. By the following morning, her course was decided. A banquet would be held on Christmas night, not only for the nobles of Navarre, but for the visiting envoys of Aragon. It would be a celebration of peace and goodwill, the kind of occasion where guards were distracted by music and courtiers by wine. And in the midst of such warmth, she would quietly set her own snare. She gave the orders without any hint of their true purpose, her voice light as she spoke of the importance of hospitality in the holy season. But in her mind, every detail, the seating, the servants chosen to attend, the placement of the guards, was already part of a larger design. The court would see a queen honoring tradition. In truth, they would be walking into the moment she had been shaping since the first whisper of treachery reached her ears. Snow fell steadily in the days before Christmas, muffling the city under a white stillness broken only by the creak of cartwheels and the toll of the cathedral bells. The palace, warmed by countless fires, glowed against the cold, its windows bright with candlelight. Inside, preparations for the Christmas night banquet moved with the controlled urgency of a well-rehearsed performance. Joan moved among the arrangements with a serene smile, her hands resting lightly on the backs of chairs as she walked the great hall, noting the polish of the silverware, the richness of the tapestries newly hung for the occasion. Her attendants assumed she was attending to the duties of a gracious hostess. None guessed how precisely she weighed each choice, the placement of tables, the routes by which servants would move, the positioning of guards who, though dressed for ceremony, were chosen for vigilance above appearance. Isabelle d'Armagnac was among those tasked with assisting in the final touches, her slender hands arranging garlands of holly and gold ribbon along the archways. She seemed at ease, speaking politely with other ladies, her eyes warm with the soft light of the season. If she sensed the quiet tightening of the queen's net, she gave no sign. Joan, watching from the dais, could almost admire the composure. Almost. On the morning of Christmas, the cathedral was filled to the rafters for the solemn mass. Joan, in a mantle of white edged with ermine, knelt in prayer beneath the painted vaults, while the choir's voices rose like clear water. The incense curled upward into the cold air, and for a time the city's divisions, ambitions, and whispers seemed far away. But as the service ended and the court began to file back toward the palace, Joan's mind returned to the work ahead. By evening, the hall was transformed. Long tables gleamed with golden plates and crystal goblets, and the fire in the great hearth roared high, its light dancing across the faces of the gathered guests. The scent of roasting meats, cinnamon, and cloves filled the air. Minstrels played from the gallery, their music weaving a spell of celebration. The seating was deliberate. Joan had placed Isabelle near the middle of the hall, not so far as to seem exiled, yet surrounded by those whose loyalty was beyond question. Lord Martin de Ibar sat further down the same table, within sight of Don Ramon de Villafranca, but the two were separated by guests who would note any attempt at private conversation. The Aragonese envoys, smiling and gracious, seemed oblivious to the subtle geometry of their placement. Through the first courses, almond soup, baked trout, and roasted capon, the hall was filled with laughter and talk. Joan raised her goblet at the appointed toasts, spoke warmly to her neighbors, and gave no outward sign of the watchfulness that sharpened her senses. She had instructed her chosen guards to watch for any movement toward the outer corridors, any passing of hands beneath the table, any servant receiving an object not part of their duties. It was during the serving of the spiced venison that the first small movement caught her attention. Isabel, leaning slightly to speak with the lady beside her, slipped one hand beneath the edge of the tablecloth. A moment later, a folded scrap of parchment lay beside her trencher, half hidden under a napkin. Joan's eyes moved almost imperceptibly to the man seated across from her, a page in the livery of Aragon, young and forgettable in the way that made such messengers dangerous. His gaze flicked toward the parchment, then away. Joan did not move. She allowed the course to end, the plates to be cleared. When the musicians struck a livelier tune and the first guests rose to dance, the page leaned forward, reaching as if to refill Isabel's goblet. In that instant, a hand, steady, gloved, closed on his wrist. One of Joan's appointed guards, smiling as though in jest, relieved him of the folded note and passed it discreetly to another, who carried it to the dais. Joan, without breaking her conversation with Philip, took the note beneath the table and opened it. The words were few, but they confirmed what she had long suspected. A meeting arranged for the night following the feast, at a location just beyond the southern gate. The matter of delivery was not named, but its urgency was plain. She let the paper rest beside her plate, folding her hands in her lap as though nothing had changed. Across the hall, Isabel's smile remained intact, her eyes bright as she applauded a passing jest. Don Ramon laughed with a noble from Estella, his manner easy. And yet, Joan knew that the hour was drawing close when neither would find such ease again. The banquet continued late into the night, the air warm with wine and the mingled scents of pine and candle wax. Joan moved among her guests as the evening waned, her voice low, her manner gracious. But every word, every gesture was part of a quiet calculation. She would not act tonight, not before the eyes of the court. Instead, she would let the next day dawn as though nothing had passed, until the moment came to follow the trail out of the palace and into the cold, where masks could no longer be worn so easily. The morning after the Christmas banquet dawned pale and cold, a thin mist curling over the rooftops of Pamplona. The palace was unusually quiet, its corridors carrying only the muffled sounds of servants clearing away the remnants of the feast. The air smelled faintly of extinguished candles and last night's fires, a lingering memory of warmth now faded. Joan rose later than usual, not from idleness, but because the night had stretched long with thought. She dressed simply in a gown of deep green wool, a fur-lined mantle draped over her shoulders, her crown replaced by a modest veil. Today, she intended to move without ceremony. By mid-morning, she had summoned Bishop Martin and the captain of the guard to her private solar. The intercepted note lay on the table between them. Joan spoke plainly. The meeting mentioned in the message would not pass unseen. Her instructions were precise. 2 trusted guards would follow Isabel discreetly if she left the palace that evening. Another pair would keep watch on the southern gate from outside, blending into the shadows of the city wall. No action would be taken until the meeting's nature was certain. The rest of the day unfolded as if in any other season of quiet after celebration. Joan received a few minor petitioners, walked briefly in the snow-dusted gardens, and spent part of the afternoon in the chapel. Isabel attended her faithfully, her hands clasped in pious composure, her voice soft when she answered the Queen's questions about the arrangements for the next day's Mass. Not once did she betray haste or unease. Evening came early. The sky deepened to a slate gray, and the cold grew sharper. The court took its supper in smaller gatherings. Many nobles were still heavy from the previous night's indulgences. Joan chose to dine alone with Philip, speaking of nothing more serious than the health of the royal falcons and the accounts from the royal vineyards. When the meal was finished, she retired to her chambers, ostensibly for rest. But she did not rest. From a narrow window overlooking the eastern courtyard, she watched the servants move about with lanterns, their light bobbing through the darkness. In the far corner, near the small postern gate, she saw the faint movement of a cloaked figure slipping into the shadows. A moment later, another figure followed. Though distance blurred their forms, Joan knew without doubt that it was Isabel, and that the second was the page from Aragon. She turned from the window and waited. The guard she had chosen would be trailing them now, silent and unseen. Hours passed in measured stillness. Joan sat by the fire, the flicker of the flames painting her face in shifting light. Her thoughts steady, unhurried. She had learned long ago that in such matters, haste spoiled the truth. It was close to midnight when the door opened and Bishop Martin entered, brushing snow from his cloak. His face was grave as he recounted what the guards had witnessed. Isabel and the page had met with a third man just beyond the southern gate, in the shadow of the old watchtower. This man, taller and wrapped in a heavy riding cloak, had passed Isabel a small, sealed chest. The exchange was brief. No words could be overheard in the wind. The page had then taken the chest and ridden south, while Isabel returned alone, slipping back through the postern gate. Joan asked no questions until the bishop had finished. Then, her voice calm, she inquired about the guards at the gate. They had seen her return, he said, and noted she carried nothing. The key was once again in the captain's possession. The path, Joan thought, had now been traced, though not yet to its end. The following morning broke with a thin sun and brittle air. Joan began the day as though nothing had happened, attending mass and greeting the nobles who came to pay their respects before departing for their estates. Isabel stood behind her chair, attentive and serene. Only once did Joan glance back at her, and in that glance there was no accusation, only the cool weight of knowing. The sealed chest was somewhere on the road to Aragon now, its contents unknown. Joan had no need to stop it yet. What mattered was the hand that had filled it and the message it carried. That knowledge would come soon enough, and when it did, it would be her, not her enemies, who chose the moment of revelation. For now, she let the court move as it always had, slow currents beneath a frozen surface, while she, unseen, set the deeper tide in motion. The week after Christmas settled into a brittle stillness, as though the city itself held its breath. The snow lay undisturbed in the palace gardens, and the trees stood black and bare against the pale sky. Many of the visiting nobles had departed, leaving the halls quieter, the air less heavy with the press of bodies and voices. Yet for Joan, the quieter the palace became, the sharper her senses grew. The sealed chest, now far along the road to Aragon, occupied her thoughts in a way that was not restless, but deliberate. She had sent no riders to intercept it. The act of restraint was its own strategy. Better to let her adversaries believe their plan unseen than to force them into hiding. A snake strikes more easily when it believes itself unobserved. Her attention turned instead to the network around Isabel. One woman, however cunning, rarely acted entirely alone in such matters. Joan began with the guards. Quietly, without ceremony, she summoned each man who had ever held the key to the postern gate in the past 6 months. She questioned them with courtesy, listening not only to their words, but to the pauses between them, to the flickers of the eyes, to the way their hands rested on the table. 2 of them she dismissed without suspicion. The third, a younger man named Esteban, answered all her questions readily, yet there was an almost imperceptible tension in him, as though he feared not what she asked, but what she might already know. Joan did not accuse him. Instead, she thanked him for his service, dismissed him, and marked his name silently in her mind. In the afternoons, she walked the long gallery overlooking the courtyard, her steps echoing softly against the stone. From here, she could see much of the palace's comings and goings. On one such walk, she noticed Isabel speaking with Lord Martin de Ibar in a shadowed alcove. The conversation was brief, their gestures restrained, but when they parted, Isabel's expression held the faintest curve of satisfaction. That evening, Joan sent for the captain of the guard. She instructed him to begin a quiet watch on Lord Martin's movements, where he went, whom he saw, what messages he sent or received. No servant was to know of it, and no record was to be written. This was to be knowledge carried only in memory, passed from mouth to ear. The new year came with little celebration, the bells of the cathedral tolling through a sky heavy with low clouds. Joan attended mass, her presence a reassurance to the people. though her thoughts were far from the sermon. She had long understood that loyalty was not a fixed thing. It shifted with opportunity, with fear, with the promise of reward. What she sought now was not only to uncover disloyalty, but to see the shape of its root, whether it was born of greed, ambition, or the subtle persuasion of foreign hands. 2 days after the turn of the year, Bishop Martin brought her news. A merchant caravan from Aragon had arrived in the city, bearing goods for trade in the winter market. Among them was a sealed cart, guarded more heavily than such goods warranted. The guards were not the merchant's own, but men in the livery of a noble house allied to the Aragonese crown. The caravan was to remain in Pamplona for 3 days before continuing north. Joan listened, the faintest trace of interest in her eyes. The chest delivered after Christmas could well have traveled with them, concealed among the goods. She gave no order to search it. Not yet. Instead, she requested that the caravan be granted lodging within the city walls, in the spirit of goodwill, as she told her council. The closer the guests, the easier they would be to watch. That night, the wind rose, rattling the shutters and carrying with it the smell of snow. Joan sat alone by the fire, her thoughts moving like the slow current of a deep river. She knew the next step would come not from her hand, but from those who believed they had passed her notice. When it did, she would be ready, not with suspicion, but with proof. And proof, once in her possession, would be the beginning of their end. The caravan from Aragon settled into the lower courtyard of the city, its presence stirring curiosity among merchants and townsfolk alike. The wagons were heavy with winter goods, bolts of dyed cloth, sacks of almonds, small barrels of olive oil, and jars of honey sealed with wax. But there was also that one cart, sealed and guarded, its contents hidden beneath a heavy canvas. The guards kept close to it, their faces impassive, their eyes watchful. From the palace balcony, Joan observed their arrival as though it were no more than a seasonal novelty. Beside her, Philip spoke of the fine craftsmanship of Aragonese wool, but Joan's gaze lingered on the guarded cart. She had no intention of revealing her interest. Instead, she allowed the court to treat the caravan as an ordinary piece of winter trade. On the first day, the merchants came before the council to request the right to sell their wares at the winter market. Joan granted it easily, instructing that they be shown every courtesy. That afternoon, she sent one of her most trusted servants, a quiet woman named Inez, into the city with a small purse of silver. Inez was not to buy goods, but to listen, to wander between the stalls and the taverns where caravan guards might loosen their tongues over wine. When Inez returned at dusk, she reported that the guards spoke little and drank less. But one of the younger men had let slip, in the warmth of a tavern fire, that the sealed cart was bound not for Pamplona, but for a rendezvous further north, where it would change escort before continuing to France. No names were given, but the man had spoken of the exchange as though it were known only to a select few. The second day brought snow, falling thick and silent, covering the cobbled streets in a clean white sheet. Joan used the storm to her advantage. She sent word to the captain of the guard that the sealed cart was to remain within the city until the roads cleared, for safety's sake. Publicly, it was an act of protection. Privately, it bought her time. That evening, she attended a small supper in the palace with a handful of courtiers, among them Isabel de Armagnac. The talk was light, stories of winters past, the reading of a poem by a young scribe. But Joan watched the way Isabel's gaze flickered toward the window whenever the wind shifted, as though waiting for something beyond the walls. Joan let the moment pass without remark, her silence as deliberate as any question. On the third day, when the snow had ceased but the roads were still slick with ice, Joan called for the captain once more. She ordered that, under cover of night, the sealed cart be moved to the palace stables for protection. The Aragonese merchants, she reasoned, could hardly object if their goods were kept under the direct safeguard of the crown. That night, long after the court had gone to rest, the cart was brought through the postern gate and into the palace grounds. Joan stood in the shadows of the stable archway as the canvas was drawn back. The chest was there, smaller than she had imagined, bound with iron straps, its lock heavy and well made. She gave no order to open it yet. Instead, she had it placed in a secure chamber within the keep, guarded by men whose loyalty was beyond question. In the quiet hours before dawn, Joan walked the length of the corridor outside that chamber, her steps slow, the torches casting long, wavering shadows. She knew the chest had been meant to pass through her city unseen, its contents carried into another realm. Now it was here, within her walls, and those who had sent it would soon realize their design had shifted beyond their control. The snow outside lay untouched in the first pale light of morning, but within the palace, a different kind of frost had begun to form, one that would spread quietly through the threads of intrigue until it reached the hands that had woven them. The morning after the chest was secured, the palace awoke under a pale, brittle sky. Frost rimed the windows, and the air in the corridors carried the faint metallic scent of cold iron from the stables. Joan began her day as she always did, hearing petitions in the audience chamber, her demeanor measured and attentive. To all appearances, nothing had altered. Yet the knowledge of what lay in the keep lent every exchange a certain weight, as though she were listening with an ear tuned to a deeper current beneath the ordinary. The Aragonese merchants came before her that afternoon, their spokesman bowing deeply before expressing concern for the delay in their journey. Joan received them with warmth, speaking of the dangers of the icy roads and her wish for their safe passage. She assured them their goods were well guarded within the palace walls, a privilege afforded only to valued guests. The spokesman smiled, murmured gratitude, but Joan noted the tightness in his jaw, the quick flicker of his eyes toward Don Ramon, who stood at the edge of the gathering. Isabel was present as well, standing among the ladies in quiet elegance. Her face betrayed nothing, but Joan caught the faintest movement of her fingers against the folds of her gown, a subtle tightening and release. It was the kind of unconscious gesture a person makes when something they have planned has shifted beyond their control. That evening, Joan dined privately with Philip. She spoke of the caravan only in passing, framing her comments as matters of hospitality. Philip, ever the pragmatic partner, nodded without pressing for details. This was one of the quiet strengths of their marriage. He trusted her judgment, even when he did not know its full extent. When night fell, Joan had the chest moved from its chamber in the keep to a smaller windowless room adjoining her private apartments. Only she and two guards, sworn by oath, knew of the transfer. There, in the glow of a single lantern, she examined it closely. The iron straps were heavy, the lock intricate, the wood darkened with age. It was no ordinary merchant's container. Its construction alone suggested it was meant to protect something of significance. She did not open it. Not yet. She intended for its seal to remain intact until those who had sent it believed themselves beyond suspicion. When it was opened, it would be in the presence of witnesses whose testimony could not be challenged. The following day, the first ripple of reaction appeared. Don Ramon requested a private audience, bringing with him the spokesman for the merchants. They spoke politely, thanking the queen for her generosity, but they pressed, ever so gently, for the release of the guarded cart. Joan listened, her hands folded, her expression serene. She reminded them of the crown's duty to safeguard visiting envoys and their possessions during inclement weather, and promised that as soon as the roads were clear, the caravan would be free to continue. When they departed, Bishop Martin entered through a side door. He had been observing from the gallery above and confirmed what Joan already sensed. Their concern was not for the caravan as a whole, but for that single cart. Their politeness, he said, was the thin skin over urgency. Joan merely inclined her head. The time for patience was drawing shorter. That night, as snow began to fall again over the city, Joan stood at her window, looking down into the darkened courtyard. The guards at the gate shifted in the cold, their spears catching the faint glow from the torches. Somewhere in the stables, horses shifted and stamped in their stalls. All was quiet. Yet she knew that beyond these walls, the news of the chess delay was already traveling back along the lines of those who had set this plan in motion. And when the news reached its origin, there would be movement. That movement would be the sign she had been waiting for. The moment to open the chest, to draw the thread tight, and to see what lay at the heart of the web she had been tracing since autumn. The next 2 days brought a subtle shift in the air of the palace. like the faint stir of wind before a snowfall. The Aragonese delegation, once content to mingle at court and attend the cathedral services, grew more reserved. Their visits to the great hall became briefer, their conversations quieter. Don Ramon no longer sought the company of the Navarrese nobles with his earlier ease, and the merchants spent more time in the city than within the palace walls. Joan noticed all of it without remark. She kept her own movements unaltered, walking the galleries at the same hours, hearing petitions as usual, attending vespers with her ladies. But beneath the appearance of constancy, her preparations moved forward. On the third evening, word reached her through Inez that Isabel had been seen slipping a small folded paper into the palm of Lord Martin de Ibar during a chance meeting in the cloister. The exchange had been brief, the gesture shielded by the folds of Isabel's mantle, but Inez had seen it clearly from the shadow of a column. Joan did not confront either of them. Instead, she summoned Bishop Martin and the captain of the guard to her solar as the candles burned low. Her voice was measured as she spoke. The chest would be opened the following evening, under the pretense of verifying its contents for safekeeping during the caravan's extended stay. She would invite Don Ramon, the merchants, and a handful of Navarrese nobles to witness the act, those whose loyalty could be relied upon. The following day dawned gray and cold, the sky heavy with unfallen snow. The court was abuzz with the news that the queen intended to open one of the caravan's guarded chests. Some whispered of gold, others of rare jewels, others still of some holy relic meant for France. The air of speculation was exactly what Joan desired. It cloaked the true nature of her suspicion beneath the more harmless curiosity of the court. When the appointed hour arrived, the chosen witnesses gathered in a small chamber near the great hall. The fire burned high, throwing flickering light against the stone walls. The chest stood upon a sturdy oak table, its iron fittings cold to the touch. 2 guards stood at either side, their spears resting but ready. Joan entered last, her mantle of dark blue trimmed with fur, her veil falling in soft folds over her shoulders. She greeted the guests with calm courtesy, her eyes lingering a fraction longer on Isabel, who stood near the back of the room. Don Ramon bowed deeply, his smile polite but strained. With a nod from Joan, the captain of the guard stepped forward, producing a heavy iron key. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness. The lid lifted slowly, the wood creaking on its hinges. Inside, the chest was not filled with gold or jewels, but with bundles of parchment and sealed letters, each bound with cords. The seals were not those of Aragon, but of several noble houses, some French, some Castilian, and a few unmistakably Navarrese. There were also 2 smaller leather cases, each tightly shut. Joan stepped closer, her hand hovering above the documents, but not yet touching them. She looked to Don Ramon. "You will, of course, explain the presence of these papers," she said, her tone smooth, almost conversational. The envoy hesitated, his composure flickering. He began to speak of trade agreements, of diplomatic correspondence, but Joan's gaze did not waver. She turned instead to the gathered nobles, letting them see the seals for themselves. Recognition sparked in more than one pair of eyes. Without raising her voice, Joan ordered that the chest and all its contents be moved to her private study to be examined in detail by her and Bishop Martin alone. The witnesses, she said, would remain bound to secrecy until the matter was resolved. As the chest was carried from the chamber, Joan caught Isabel's eye for the briefest moment. The lady's face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. That single glance told Joan more than any confession could have. The web was tightening, and its center was now firmly within her grasp. The chamber Joan had chosen for the examination of the chest was small, windowless, and quiet, its thick stone walls shutting out even the faintest sound from the rest of the palace. A single fire burned low in the hearth, casting a steady amber light over the long table where the chest had been set. 2 guards stood outside the door, and none but Joan and Bishop Martin were permitted to enter. When the last echo of the closing door faded, Joan drew a chair to the table and began the slow work of untying the cords around the first bundle of documents. The bishop sat opposite her, his keen eyes following every movement. The parchment crackled faintly as she unfolded it, the ink still sharp and dark. The The first letters were addressed to nobles in Navarre, each bearing a seal that matched the one she had seen in the audience chamber during the autumn. The contents spoke of trade disputes, requests for small favors, agreements over land. Harmless on the surface, but the tone suggested an intimacy that went beyond official correspondence. Certain phrases, veiled but unmistakable, hinted at an understanding between the writers that loyalty might be shaped by more than duty. The next bundle was different. These letters were in a more hurried hand, the script less polished, and the seals foreign. They spoke openly of troop movements along the Castilian border, of disputes in the French court, and of the advantage to be gained should the Navarrese crown stand apart from France in the coming year. One letter in particular caught Joan's attention. It referenced a trusted voice within the Queen's household who could be relied upon to guide decisions in a favorable direction. No name was given, but the implication was clear. From the leather cases came smaller, tightly folded papers written in a code neither Joan nor the bishop could read at once. They placed these aside for later study, knowing they might hold the most guarded truths. Beneath them lay a ledger, its pages filled with lists of names and amounts of coin. The sums were not vast, but they were regular, suggesting the quiet maintenance of influence through steady payments. Joan closed the ledger and sat back, her fingers resting lightly on its cover. In her mind, the threads she had been following since the first whisper of intrigue began to knot together. The presence of Navarrese seals, the mention of a voice within her own household, the connection to Aragon, all pointed toward a network designed to shape her court's decisions from within, using friendship, persuasion, and, where needed, coin. Bishop Martin broke the silence first. Majesty, this is enough to move against them. Joan's gaze did not leave the chest. It is enough to strike, she said quietly, but not yet to end the matter without doubt. She knew that to act now would cut away the branch, but leave the root hidden. And roots had a way of growing back, deeper and harder to reach. Instead, she decided the chest's discovery would remain known only to those present. The merchants would be told it had been stored for safety. The court would be left to their speculation. Meanwhile, the bishop would quietly send copies of the most revealing letters to her allies in France and among the loyal houses of Navarre. Their responses would confirm who could be trusted when the time came to act. That night, Joan walked alone in the covered gallery that overlooked the snow-covered courtyard. The lanterns cast pools of light on the flagstones, and her breath rose in small clouds before her. From here, she could see the faint outline of the southern gate in the distance, the very place where Isabel had once met under cover of darkness. The chest was locked once more and returned to its guarded chamber, but Joan felt its weight still with her, not in her hands, but in her mind. She now held proof not just of treachery, but of how it had been woven quietly into the life of her court. And with proof came the power to choose the moment of revelation, to ensure that when the web was torn apart, none of its makers would escape the collapse. The first days of January passed in a deceptive calm. The court resumed its ordinary rhythm, morning petitions, afternoon hunts for those inclined to ride in the snow, and the slow preparations for the Feast of Epiphany. To the unknowing eye, there was nothing amiss, but Joan's gaze, sharpened by what she now held in the guarded chamber, saw the faint tremors beneath the surface. Isabel continued her duties with unwavering grace, arranging the queen's attire for ceremonies, overseeing the embroidery of a new altar cloth, and moving among the ladies with quiet conversation. If she feared discovery, she hid it well. Yet Joan noted how rarely Isabel left the palace now, and how her once easy manner with the Aragonese envoys had cooled to polite distance. The retreat was subtle but telling, an animal drawing back from the snare it can suddenly feel. Lord Martin de Ibar appeared less often in the Great Hall, citing the demands of his lands in the south. When he did come, he kept to the edges of gatherings, avoiding the open debates where Joan might address him directly. His absence was almost as revealing as Isabel's presence. Joan's next step was taken quietly. She called for Inez in the early hours, before the rest of the household had risen. In the privacy of her solar, she handed the servant a folded sheet containing brief instructions and the name of a man in the port town of Bayonne. an old contact of the crown whose loyalty had been proven in more than one dangerous season. Inez was to travel in secrecy, carrying with her carefully chosen copies of the letters from the chest. These would pass beyond Navarre into hands that could verify the movements and identities hinted at in the documents. By sending the copies north instead of south, Joan ensured that any whisper of the chest's contents reaching Aragon would be delayed, confused, and, if she was fortunate, contradicted by what her allies would say in return. It was a measure to buy time, but also to shape the field on which the next move would be played. The Feast of Epiphany arrived with clear skies and crisp air. The cathedral was bright with candlelight, the gold of the altar gleaming under the gaze of the gathered faithful. Joan stood in the front, her mantle of deep crimson trimmed with sable, Philip beside her in stately silence. The choir's voices filled the space, and the scent of frankincense hung heavy in the cold air. After the service, the court returned to the palace for the customary banquet. Joan ensured that the seating was once again deliberate. Isabel was placed near ladies from loyal houses, far from Don Ramon and the remaining Aragonese merchants. Lord Martin, invited under the formality of the feast, was seated where every movement of his hands could be seen by one of Joan's trusted men. The banquet passed without visible disturbance, yet Joan noticed how Don Ramon's attention drifted often toward the doors, as though awaiting someone who never arrived. When the last course had been cleared and the minstrel's music softened, she excused herself from the high table and stepped into the antechamber, where Bishop Martin was waiting. In a low voice, he reported that one of the Aragonese guards had been found in the lower city, attempting to send a message by way of a cloth merchant. The message, hastily written, spoke of delays beyond reason and necessity to recover the goods before they are opened. The merchant, loyal to the crown, had brought it directly to the bishop. Joan read the message once, then folded it carefully. The phrase, "before they are opened," told her that the contents of the chest were still unknown to its senders, an advantage she intended to preserve until the precise moment of her choosing. That night she lingered alone in the chapel after Compline, the candles burning low, the cold of the stone floor rising through her shoes. She prayed not for victory, she had learned that such prayers were folly, but for clarity, for the patience to hold her hand until the strike could be made without error. For she knew that the snare was tightening, and soon those within it would feel the first pull. The snow that fell in the days after Epiphany came fine and steady, covering the city in a pale veil that softened every edge. From the high windows of the palace, Joan could see the rooftops glistening under the winter light, the chimneys sending up slow, twisting columns of smoke. Life within the walls moved at a slower pace in such weather, the courtiers lingering longer near the hearths, their voices low and measured. Joan, however, was anything but idle. The chest remained locked in its guarded chamber, untouched since the night she had examined its contents with Bishop Martin. Each day she felt its presence like a weight in the air, not burdensome, but constant, a reminder that the next move was hers to make. Inez had not yet returned from Bayonne, but a message arrived under the seal of Joan's contact there. It was brief, confirming that the copied letters were now in the hands of trusted men who would trace their origins and the channels by which they had been sent. The work would take time. Those who trafficked in treachery rarely left their signatures in open ink. Meanwhile, the Aragonese delegation grew more restless. Don Ramon requested several audiences, each framed as a discussion of trade agreements or border tolls, but always circling back to the question of when their caravan might depart. Joan received him with her usual composure, her replies courteous but without commitment. Each refusal to hasten their journey was wrapped in reason so sound that to argue against it would appear ungracious. Isabel kept her composure, yet Joan sensed the quiet strain in her movements. She had grown quieter among the ladies, speaking less in the lively chatter of the embroidery rooms, taking more solitary walks in the cloisters. It was during one of these walks, on a pale afternoon, that Joan observed her from the far end of the gallery. Isabel paused near a narrow window, her hand resting on the stone sill, gazing out toward the southern hills as though measuring a distance in her mind. That evening, Joan called the captain of the guard to her chamber. In a voice low enough that even the fire's crackle seemed loud against it, she gave an order. Isabel was to be followed whenever she left the palace, whether on foot or horseback, with no exceptions. Those chosen for the task were to remain unseen and report directly to Joan herself. The days that followed were marked by small signs. Isabel was seen exchanging a brief word with Lord Martin in the shadow of the chapel door. Don Ramon lingered longer than usual in the stables, speaking with one of the caravan's guards. A serving boy reported overhearing two Aragonese merchants speaking in hurried tones in their own tongue, their faces tense. None of these moments were proof, but each was another thread in the weaving. One evening, as the city bells marked Compline, Bishop Martin brought news that quickened Joan's thoughts. A rider from the south had arrived at the Aragonese lodgings, delivering a sealed packet to Don Ramon. No one knew what it contained, but the envoy had gone directly to his quarters and remained there for the rest of the night. Joan did not send to intercept it, not yet. She wanted him to believe the packet had reached him unseen, so that whatever action followed might reveal its purpose. For now, the chest in her possession was bait enough. This new piece would simply deepen the snare. That night, she walked the long length of the upper gallery, the snowlight from the courtyard casting a pale glow through the narrow windows. Her footsteps were slow, her thoughts deliberate. She knew the moment to act was drawing close, but it was not here yet. When it came, it would come with unmistakable clarity, a shift so sharp that all who were watching and all who were caught would know at once that the queen had been watching them far longer than they had guessed. The snows deepened in the last weeks of January, lying so thick along the palace walls that the wind carved strange shapes into their drifts. The city seemed hushed beneath the weight of it, the sounds of daily life muted, as though the world itself had drawn closer to listen. Within the palace, fires burned high, tapestries hung heavier to keep out the cold, and yet Joan felt no warmth beyond the flame. The air was thick with waiting. Inez returned from Bayonne just after midday on a day so cold that her breath clung to her veil in tiny crystals. Joan received her in the privacy of her solar, the shutters closed against the winter glare. The news was given in a low, steady voice. The letters from the chest had been traced to several sources, but one pattern stood clear. Many had been penned by intermediaries in Toulouse, sent north to France or east to Aragon through merchants who traveled under safe conduct. Among the names most often linked in the correspondence was that of Lord Martin de Ibar. Joan let the words settle between them, her hands folded in stillness on the table. It was no longer suspicion but proof, and proof of a kind that could not be smoothed away by polite denials. The trusted voice mentioned in the letters now had a face. That evening, she attended Vespers as usual, Isabel at her side, Lord Martin seated only a few paces away. The service was long, the chant of the psalms echoing against the stone vaults. Joan's eyes were lowered in prayer, but her mind measured each step that would follow. This was no longer a matter to be delayed for patience's sake. The threads were now bound tightly enough to pull without fear of the weave slipping apart. The decision was made to act on the next turning of the week, when the court would gather for the winter's final great feast before Lent. The moment of festivity would be the perfect mask, and its ending the perfect stage for revelation. Joan shared her plan only with Bishop Martin and the captain of the guard, each sworn to absolute silence. In the days leading to the feast, her manner changed not at all. She spoke graciously with Don Ramon when he sought her counsel, listened attentively to the petitions of the city guilds, and even smiled at a jest offered by Lord Martin in the great hall. Isabel dressed her for these audiences in rich winter velvets, her hands deft, her voice soft. None would have guessed that the queen's thoughts were fixed on the very undoing of those who moved so close beside her. The evening of the feast came clear and still, the snow outside sparkling like scattered crystal under the moonlight. The great hall blazed with torches, the tables heavy with dishes of venison, roasted fowl, and stewed apples scented with cinnamon. Music drifted from the gallery, and the hum of conversation filled the air. Joan presided from the high table, her crown light upon her hair, her mantle of deep green fur catching the glow of the fire. Across the room, Isabel sat among the ladies, her eyes bright in the candlelight. Lord Martin conversed easily with a merchant from Estella, his hands moving in deliberate gestures. Don Ramon, seated near the center of the hall, laughed at something said by one of his fellow envoys, though the laugh did not quite reach his eyes. When the final course was served and the first guests began to rise from the tables, Jean gave a quiet signal. The doors to the hall were closed, the guards stepping into place as though merely guiding the flow of the crowd. The music faded, replaced by a silence that seemed to grow heavier with each heartbeat. Jean rose slowly, her gaze moving over the gathered faces. In her voice there was no anger, no triumph, only the cool steadiness of a queen who had carried the weight of her knowledge long enough. She spoke of loyalty, of the sacred trust between crown and subject, of the dangers that crept not from distant armies but from within the very walls meant to keep them safe. And then she said the words that turned the air to stone. The chest, she told them, had been opened. Its contents were known. The names written there had been read, and those names were here, among them. For a moment after Joan's words, the great hall stood utterly still. The torches hissed softly in their sconces, and the fire in the hearth cracked, its pop of resin echoing in the silence like the snap of a breaking thread. No one moved. It was as though the entire court had drawn a single breath and held it, unsure whether to speak or remain silent. Joan let the quiet stretch until it became almost unbearable. Then she turned her gaze first to Lord Martin de Ibar. His face had lost none of its composure, yet his hands rested flat upon the table, fingers spread as though to steady himself against an unseen tilt in the floor. "Lord Martin," she said, her tone even, "your hand appears often in these letters, too often to be mistaken for chance. Do you deny that you carried words meant to sway the will of Navarre away from her crown?" He did not answer at once. His eyes moved briefly to the assembled nobles, perhaps searching for some sign of support. Finding none, he inclined his head slightly. "I have always served Navarre," he replied, his voice smooth, "and I have spoken only as any man might who wishes for the realm's prosperity." Joan did not smile. "Prosperity built on foreign coin and secret counsel is not prosperity, my lord. It is purchase." Her gaze shifted then to Isabel de Armagnac. The lady's face was pale, though her lips were pressed into a faint semblance of poise. "And you, Isabel," Joan continued, "trusted above many, keeper of my chamber's quiet, have you not been the voice within that these letters promised to their recipients?" Isabel's hands tightened in her lap. "Majesty, I have spoken only in your service." "In my service," Joan said softly, "or in the service of those who met you beneath the olive grove on a winter's night." The words struck with precision. A murmur rippled through the hall. Don Ramon shifted in his seat, his own mask beginning to crack. "Majesty," he began, "perhaps there is misunderstanding. These letters may be the work of others." Joan raised a hand and the room fell silent again. "The chest is here. The seals are intact. The names are written. There is no misunderstanding, Don Ramon. The only question is whether those whose loyalty has wandered will face the truth openly or wait for it to be read aloud before all." Her words carried no threat in tone, yet the weight of them was such that even the envoys glanced toward the guarded doors. Joan stepped forward from the high table, the train of her mantle whispering against the rushes. "I have no desire to see my hall turned into a court of judgment," she said, "but neither will I allow the crown to be played as a piece in another realm's game. Those named in the letters will remain within the palace until I decide their place. No message will leave these walls. No meeting will be held beyond my sight." She gave a nod to the captain of the guard. Without clamor or show, the men moved through the crowd, placing themselves quietly beside Lord Martin, Isabel, and two of the Aragonese merchants. The hall seemed to exhale then, the tension easing but not dissipating, for every guest knew that the stillness was not safety. It was only the pause before the next movement. Joan returned to her seat, the eyes of the court upon her. She spoke no further accusation, offered no public reading of the damning words. That would come later, in chambers chosen for such matters. For now, she let the hall absorb the fact that the queen's gaze had been upon them longer than they had guessed, and that the reach of her knowledge was not easily escaped. When at last the doors were opened, The guests left in subdued silence, their laughter gone, their whispers careful. In the echoing corridor beyond, the sound of footsteps marked the slow escort of those who would not be returning to their chambers that night. And in the high seat at the end of the now empty table, Joan sat alone for a time, her hands resting lightly on the polished wood, her eyes fixed on the darkened hall, as though she could still see the shape of every face that had been turned toward her. The winter night outside was silent, the snow lying deep against the palace walls, but within, the air was thick with the low, steady movements of those carrying out Joan's orders. The corridors were lit only by torches, their light flickering over stone as the chosen guards escorted Lord Martin, Isabel, and the two Aragonese merchants to the small, fortified chambers that served as the queen's private holding rooms. There was no shouting, no resistance, only the muted sound of boots and the soft clink of keys turning in locks. Joan remained in her private study after the hall had emptied, the chest placed once more upon the table before her. Its presence felt different now, not a burden of suspicion, but a sealed record of what had been uncovered. Bishop Martin sat opposite, his hands folded, his expression calm but watchful. "They will speak," he said quietly, "though each in their own way. Martin will argue for his intent, Isabel will plead her loyalty, and the merchants, they will say little, for their tongues are tied to orders from beyond our walls." Joan's gaze lingered on the chest. "Let them speak. I want every word they choose to say, and every silence they choose to keep." The interrogations began at first light. Lord Martin was brought before her in the smaller audience chamber, where the fire burned low and the cold air kept the senses sharp. He stood without bowing deeply, though his voice was measured as he claimed that his dealings had been for the good of Navarre, that alliances must be woven quietly as well as openly. Joan listened without interruption, and when he had finished, she asked only, "And did the coin you took come as part of this quiet weaving?" His silence then was longer than any answer could have been. Isabel's turn came next. She entered pale but composed, her eyes lowered. She spoke of her years of service, of her closeness to the queen, of her desire to keep Navarre secure. But when Joan asked why she had met under darkness in the olive grove, why messages had passed from her to the caravan guards, Isabel's voice faltered. "I thought," she began, but the rest of the thought never came. Joan did not press her for it. She had learned that sometimes a broken sentence told more than a finished one. The merchants spoke little indeed, answering questions with the barest of courtesies. Their role was clear enough. They had been couriers, carrying the words of others across borders, their loyalty lying not with any queen, but with the coin that paid their passage. By evening, the truth was no longer hidden in shadows or parchment. Joan had not only the proof within the chest, but the weight of their own words and silences. The web that had stretched from the olive grove to Aragon's envoys, from secret letters to foreign courts, was now visible in full. She did not order their immediate punishment. That would come after careful consideration, for Joan knew that the manner of justice was as important as the fact of it. To act in haste might satisfy the moment, but to act with deliberation would send a message that would travel farther than any courier could ride. In the days that followed, the court moved in a subdued quiet. Don Ramon requested leave to depart with what remained of his delegation, but Joan denied him, citing the need for further talks on trade. Isabel no longer attended the queen's dressing. Another lady now held that place. Lord Martin's absence from the hall was a constant reminder of how swiftly a favored seat could be taken away. One evening, as the snow fell thick outside, Jean walked alone through the gallery that overlooked the southern hills. The lamps burned steadily along the wall, their light warm against the cold glass of the windows. She thought of the long months since autumn, of the careful watching, the patience, the deliberate gathering of proof. In the end, it had been less a matter of striking than of allowing the trap to close under its own weight. Those who had believed themselves hidden had been undone not by a single blow, but by the slow, quiet certainty of a queen who saw more than she ever spoke. And as she stood there, listening to the wind move against the palace stones, Joan understood that the greatest strength of her reign lay not in the crown upon her head, but in the knowledge that within her walls, No shadow moved without her seeing it.